Hi, this is a recording made after our keynote INSET Summer 26. We are focusing on transformative action as the third part in a year-long focus on adaptive teaching. And we began with formulating learning goals, aligning tasks with those goals. Then we moved on to looking at effective formative assessment to reveal evidence of understanding, and this is the third stage of that. So we're now looking at how to adjust, how to respond in real time in the classroom. A good maxim for the term, I believe, is do not carry on regardless. So successful adaptive teaching should see the lesson moving away from a pre-prescribed path and responding in real time to the evidence of understanding that is revealed from all pupils. This is the quote from the Early Career Framework relating to adaptive teaching, and it's really ensuring that all pupils get the same opportunities to achieve the same learning goals, and those learning goals should always be challenging for everybody, and we need to support pupils potentially in different ways in order to achieve those goals, but that there shouldn't be a limit as to what they can achieve, and there shouldn't be different goals for different pupils. And this leads nicely onto these two terms. Any teacher with any years of experience will be familiar with the term differentiation, and adaptive teaching is a reframing of that. I think at their heart, both of these had the same good intentions, and those intentions were to support pupils of varying needs. But unfortunately, differentiation has suffered from some potential lethal mutations and led to actually almost the opposite, led to pupils being treated differently and achieving different levels because of it. So I've put some information in here that's going to appear in a second. I've adapted the table from Jade Pierce's book, Demystifying Adaptive Teaching. I've added a few bits and paraphrased as well. And in the differentiation column, a lot of things will say different, fixed, and in the adaptive teaching column, a lot of the bullet points will say same, flexible, dynamic. And what happened to differentiation is it's become, pupils have been labelled, and that those labels have been almost impossible to shake, either struggling, average, gifted and talented, and pupils have been exposed to different goals. Everybody in the class should be able to achieve this goal, but actually only some of you will be able to achieve this goal. And then obviously chilly challenges where pupils get to select their own tasks according to how much they self-report as wanting to do something challenging or something slightly easier. And it meant that pupils weren't all achieving or working towards the same goals, and it led to potentially a fixed mindset amongst a lot of pupils. There were obviously ceilings that they just couldn't get past, fixed groupings, fixed setting, and whether adaptive teaching is same challenging learning goals for all pupils, and they're just adjusting the level of support that is required in order to help all pupils get to those challenging learning goals. So here's the information, and I think very much with adaptive teaching, the onus is obviously on the teacher to reveal the understanding and the knowledge of the pupils as often as possible so that they can adapt, to have no preconceived ideas about what pupils can do, so that they can be responsive in the moment and help all pupils achieve the same. So at Clifton, we spent a year developing the Clifton Compass, the 10 touchstones of teaching, and this is now embedded in all of our teaching and learning. These are the 10 touchstones. They do all have a descriptor, which are not going to come up on this slide, but we really keep this at the heart of everything that we do, and we've been working systematically on touchstones as our termly T&L focus. And we started with the most foundational touchstone, so behaviour management, and we've sort of moved on from there. And once we've done all 10, we will then go back and we will look at different touchstones according to the contextual need at the time, and we will broaden our understanding, we'll deepen our understanding, we'll look at maybe a wider range of strategies and look at some more nuance. So last academic year, these were the touchstones that we focused on, starting with behaviour management, moving on to strong starts, which obviously helps has some elements of behaviour management in it, but also cognitive preparation for learning. And then participation and equity, trying to keep the participation ratio in the class as high as possible and making sure participation is as equitable as possible. So this year, as I said earlier, we've been focusing on adaptive teaching. So we started in our first term, which we call Michaelmas, so the MIC, with goals before tasks. So looking at grappling with curricular documents and working out what is the learning journey actually going to be here. Teachers to craft clear learning intentions across the whole journey, and then to signpost with success competencies that are more measurable and that are helping to sort of define the journey and sort of the progress. Then we looked at formative hinges. Sorry, I was going back to goals before tasks, making sure that once those learning goals were established, that all of the tasks that are planned in the lessons align with those learning goals, and that we're not falling into the trap of task-based planning, just sort of filling the time with something that pupils are doing, that it is actually helping them to achieve those learning goals. So then in our previous term from now, we looked at formative assessment as a whole. We looked at a potential difference between continuous formative assessment and critical point formative assessment. We looked at, so if we're doing continuous formative assessment, it will be everything that we're doing in the class that gives us evidence of pupil learning. It might not be all pupils together. It might be maybe when we're circulating during an individual task and we're seeing what they're writing, or circulating and hearing what they're saying during their pair talk, or we might be conducting some cold calling from the front and sampling some knowledge and understanding. And then critical point formative assessment, we looked at hinge questions as a really impactful strategy for achieving an elicitation of the understanding of all pupils in the class at the same time. And we talked about the fact that hinge points should be based on really key conceptual knowledge that is necessary to progress in the learning journey. And then this term, we're now looking at we're sort of imagining we're at that point where we revealed the understanding, we're looking at all the pupil responses from the hinge question. Now, what do we do as teachers? What do we do with that information? How do we adjust our teaching in the moment to respond to that? So these are the 4 touchstones from the compass that this year relates to the most. And we always justify against the model of the mind here. And we've got the image at the bottom in that we haven't just got one mind in our classroom, we've got multiple minds in our classroom. So we've got to be very mindful of social, cultural and structural conditions. And obviously I've credited some very influential people here who have developed these images that we've adapted. So we've got the top model originally from Daniel Willingham and modified by Oliver Caviglioli, Josh Goodrich, Pets McRae and Ollie Lovell. And at the bottom, we've got the classroom image from walkthroughs. So for this year, for our adaptive teaching focus, obviously there will be elements of all of these principles of learning, which are in the right-hand diagrams, but particularly number 1, making sure that we are planning and selecting curricula so that it is sequenced and delivered for the mind of a novice. We are then ensuring all pupils in the class are able to think deeply about that which will lead to learning, about salient information. And we are constantly gathering information relating to pupil understanding so that we can adjust and respond and act in the moment to change our instruction in ways that will help all pupils to succeed. So here is a visual that we've got, our learning journey. We've used this across the whole year. So just as an aside, at the bottom in red is what we worked on the previous academic year, and I just wanted to emphasise that we will not be successful in anything else if we haven't got the foundations sorted. So if the behaviour management isn't tight, if we haven't got equitable high ratio participation, and if our teaching is not accessible by design. So moving on to our learning journey again this year. So again, in our first term, we looked at the learning intentions, the success competencies, the aligning the tasks, and this gives us information about what pupils knew before, what the goal is of this learning journey, where they are actually going to go, and the tasks are the means by which they can process the information and make their meaning as they move through the learning journey. Last term was our focus on formative assessment. So where are they now in this moment? What is their current understanding and knowledge? Particular focus obviously on hinge questions to elicit evidence of understanding from all pupils in relation to a really crucial concept. And now we've got that information, we need to make a decision about what to do in the lesson, which will ensure that all pupils can make progress and achieve the same challenging learning goals. I was very pleased over Easter. I read Jade Pierce's book, Demystifying Adaptive Teaching, How to Teach to the Top. Really pleased to see this diagram in it because it aligns perfectly with what we've been doing this year. So Jade has got her 3 pillars of adaptive teaching, which map to our 3 terms and how we have decided to break down adaptive teaching. So we started in our first term with pillar 1 with our goals before tasks, clear learning intentions. In term 2 with our formative assessment, we looked at critical point hinge questions. And in term 3 with our responsive teaching, our real in the moment actions and adjustments. I was also fortunate enough to attend Jade's talk at the Teaching and Learning Summit this year, and I made these sketch notes at that time and I've just sampled from them here. Just really stood out to me that we've really got to make sure that we are assessing understanding in the moment at that point in time, and we are not under any illusions or preconceptions about what that might be based on what pupils have done before, or maybe what data is telling us, what Midges or Alice are telling us. We aren't therefore making any preconceptions, any assumptions based on prior attainment. We are giving every pupil the same chance to show us their understanding in real time, and that is the information we are acting upon. In order for us to then implement effective adjustments in the lesson, we've got to obviously do planning beforehand. There has to be some cognitive preparation, hopefully also some preparation involving planning notes and resourcing. And if we do that, we will be able to make those adjustments, take that action in light of the evidence that is revealed, and our adjustments and our actions will be supportive, and they will enable pupils to make progress towards the same challenging learning goals. I've put the 2 teacher standards up here that have a lot of content in them relating to adaptive teaching, and that makes sense if we look at it in light of these sort of 2 points before the lesson and implementation in the lesson. TS4 is about planning and delivering well-structured lessons, and TS5 is about making sure that we're adapting our teaching to the strengths and needs of all pupils. Adaptive teaching, so I've highlighted the adapt here just to really reinforce that message that in a classroom where successful adaptive teaching is happening, the lesson is not following a pre-prescribed path, but there adjustments are being made in light of evidence of knowledge and understanding that the teacher is intentionally eliciting at multiple time points throughout the lesson. The teacher does checks for understanding, obviously continuously, but that might not be with all pupils, so they do whole class checks for understanding, they look at the responses and they make adjustments in real time. And again, going back to those sort of 2 focus areas before the lesson, and in order to successfully implement in the lesson, we've got what do we have to do in advance, so that we can be successful implementing in the moment. And as I said before, there has to be at least some cognitive preparation for this on the part of the teacher, so some consideration of what adjustments might be suitable for different levels of understanding. Using an if-then structure is a really useful way to frame that. If I need to re-explain because most pupils misunderstand, then I'll need a different explanation that is more accessible. Not the same explanation slower, a different explanation that is more accessible. And I'll expand upon what more accessible explanations look like a little bit later on. And then some level of resourcing and preparation and noting, so that when we are in the lesson with a very high cognitive load ourselves because of everything that's going on, we have the best chance of implementing those adjustments so that our pupils can be successful. So, at the very least, some notes in your planning notes, some tweaks to the resources potentially, maybe a slide with an alternate image on it, or maybe a graphic organizer that you can use if needed, potentially some criteria, some sentence starters, something that you can use if it is needed. And then in the moment, we have done our check for understanding. We're actively scanning, not just moving our head from side to side, but we are actively taking in the information, and we are looking at patterns of understanding. We're looking at trends across the class, and we are deciding in the moment, what should I do differently now? Or what should I do in order so that everybody in this class can come back to the same level if there are different levels of understanding. So we have to act. We have to take action after a check for understanding. And that will be adjustments, and they might be something that we do as teachers, and it might be something that we ask pupils to do as well. So every term we either use one or more walkthroughs that are already in existence from the Fantastic Walkthroughs books, or I adapt one of the walkthroughs if I don't feel it quite fits our context, or I make a walkthrough from scratch. This is one that I've made from scratch for this responding to understanding in real time. It's the third this year. I made one in our first term for goals before tasks, one for our formative assessment hinge focus last term, and now this one for adaptive teaching. So we've got that person on the blocks in the stopwatch is referring to teachers having to prepare before the lesson and be proactive and resource and cognitively consider these adjustments and add them to their planning notes. We've then got obviously the deployment of the check for understanding in the lesson that has to happen, and then we've got the action, the adjustment, the response of the teacher to the evidence of understanding with the action board. And we've split the action into three because in all the reading I've done and everybody that's talking about adaptive teaching and the responsive part of it, it seems that there are three main patterns of understanding that we will be seeing when we do the check for understanding. So either all or most pupils will misunderstand, there will be varied levels of understanding, or all or most will understand. So these are the thumbnails for each of the steps of the walkthrough. In our CPD booklet, I expand upon these with descriptors for each one. Here we've just got the images. So you can see for step 3, the responding of the teacher adaptively in real time. We've got 3A, most people or all pupils misunderstand, and I've grouped the possible adjustments into 2 main groups there. The puzzle pieces representing a different explanation, the sort of flow chart representing modelling. 3B, mixed varied understanding in the class. I've separated the adjustments and the actions and the responses into 3 main groups. Scaffolding, support, prompts, cues. In the middle there, just more practice. And on the right, using peers, so pairs, small groups, strategic whole class discussion. And in 3C, all or most understand, great. We can, again, I've grouped the potential next steps into sort of 2 groups. On the left with the head and the tree, we've got the deepen, broaden, extend, encourage, creativity, transfer. Or on the right, we've got continue with the next stage of the learning journey. And obviously, every walkthrough has a title page with a bit of justification. So I've got that as well here. And in this walkthrough, because it's focusing mainly on the action the teacher takes after a check for understanding and how we can be successful in that, it's trying to get the focus not just on the assessment, but on the response the teacher makes, the adjustments they make after the assessment. And lots of people have sort of had a look at this and reframed it, particularly obviously Harry Fletcher-Wood and Renee Knaber, who were sort of rephrasing the title formative assessment into either responsive teaching or formative action, again to shift the emphasis onto that response of the teacher, the adjustment, the action. Obviously, we've got Jade with her 3 pillars of adaptive teaching, and with the real focus in her book on the proactive things that you do before the lesson, which is our step 1, and then the implementation in the lesson, which is our step 3. And it's really great and to remind ourselves that if we do this, we are actually doing the best high quality teaching for our SEND pupils as well. Obviously, that is barring any person specific adjustments that need to be made. And obviously we've got potentially teachers making adjustments, and also learners. So pupils should be taking action as well, possibly prompted by the teacher, and hopefully eventually in their own independent study. And this is what Dylan William emphasises, and then Lynn Corno says that, we keep doing this, we keep modelling this, pupils keep being exposed to this sort of cycle, they will then transfer that and learn and be able to be self-regulated independent learners lifelong, which is our ultimate goal. So last term I did this visual at the top here of the learning journey, and we looked at how you start teaching in a lesson, and sometimes unbeknownst to you, the understanding of pupils is going away from the black line, which is where you expect it to be. You do continuous formative assessment, you do cold calling, you listen, you circulate, you catch one pupil here, a couple of pupils here, you're aware of their understanding at those points. But then there comes a critical point where you should assess the understanding of the whole class, and that's represented by the blue vertical line with the blobs on it, a multiple choice hinge question, and at that point you get the opportunity to sample the understanding of the whole class and bring people back by doing something differently. And here are our three levels of understanding. In our INSET, our teachers actually, I stopped talking at this point, and our teachers actually spent their time in their mixed groups looking at the responses, the adjustments they would make, looking at those three patterns. And obviously we then recommended the most evidence-backed, evidence-informed suggestions for that. There is also always the recommendation that teachers need to take these and adapt them for their own context, their own subject, their own stage, their own pupils, their own classrooms. So if we look at all or most misunderstand, this indicates that instruction has failed, and there are only really two things we can do in this point. We can explain in a more accessible, different way, which will often involve more permanent information, possibly on whiteboards or slides, simplifying our language, removing any redundant or superfluous information because novices can't select what is salient and what isn't, using additional examples and non-examples, and possibly carefully selected analogies. Or we could model. If it's a process we're trying to teach or a procedure, modelling might be appropriate. Live modelling under the visualizer with the teacher narrating their thought process. Chunking a model, so explaining one step, then giving the pupil some practice, then explaining, then giving some practice. If the pattern of understanding we see is varied, if there are varied levels of understanding when we do our check for understanding, then it's about either providing support that wasn't there the first time or adapting the level of support that is already there. And this could be, I've grouped this into three, so this could be to do with potentially the level of support we give them in terms of prompts so that it supports their working memory, cues to direct their attention, and some examples here, giving them criteria, partially completed examples, graphic organizers just to organize the information in, that might really help them to make connections and make meaning, or helping them to get started with their answers. We could, the second sort of level here, a group of adjustments, is just to give them more rehearsal. I've called it rehearsal for encoding because sort of keeping it on the same theme, similar context, because it might just be they just need more exposure, and your explanation was really quite good, but they just need more practice. Or utilizing peers, so pairs, small groups, strategic class discussion, where you bring in pupils that you know understand to explain their reasoning. The pairs and the small groups could be homogeneous, where all the pupils have the same understanding, or they could be heterogeneous, where they have different understanding. And in that case, you could bring in an element of peer tutoring. So flexible grouping based on need, and you could give those groups particular tasks to do that will help them in the need they've shown in the moment. Or if all or most understand, the third pattern of understanding, you can move on with the next stage of the learning journey, or deepen and extend and really sort of encourage that creativity and that wonder. The advantage of this second option is that it frees you up to support. If there was maybe one or two pupils that really didn't understand, you can really spend some quality time with them, making sure that their understanding is secure. So move on, fairly self-explanatory. Or deepen, extend, encourage. What could you do there? Well, I really like the idea of back pocket questions, or thunks, where, so for biology, some of my favourite ones are: what if chlorophyll was black? What if we could digest cellulose? And what if we could ventilate or breathe liquid? You could get pupils to perform elaborative interrogation, either verbally or written, where they either say or write what, when, where, because, how, if, so sentences. So they're really interrogating that information and making links. If their understanding is secure, it's really great to get them to try and generate misconceptions and explain why they're misconceptions, much the same way as a teacher would do when designing a hinge question. Or give them some rehearsal for transfer with different and unfamiliar contexts. So at this point, that was the end of my keynote, and a few members of my teaching and learning team stood up to give some reflections on their hinge questions from last term and their professional development and their reflective practice. So we had a member of the history department from the upper school sharing how he's been using hinge questions in order to help pupils sequence and reveal the understanding of sequencing, because that's a really important element of history. We then had one of our drama teachers sharing how she has really worked on developing a practical hinge question that pupils can do whilst they are sort of either moving or in an open space when they're not at desks with pens and pencils and mini whiteboards. And we had a member of our upper maths department sharing some of his sort of really kind of good solutions to some of the logistical challenges about how does the pupil reveal their response, and really making sure that front loading is done when you deliver the stimulus material and they know exactly what to do. And then a bit of a sort of an open question: what does it mean if there is 100% success? This is my teaching and learning team. I've anonymised all the names for sharing, but we have professional learning ambassadors and we have professional learning lead teachers. The lead teachers are also trained and practicing instructional coaches. And this team is purely voluntary sign up. Teachers sign up via a Google form. They have a chat with me about what we're trying to do here at Clifton with teaching and learning and our philosophy. And then if they want to become an instructional coach as well, they have to be coached for one term. They undergo formal training, then coached for one term, and then coaching a coach for one term, and then they're able to coach. So these are it's a really great team. They are reflective practitioners, they are evangelists, they are advocates for continuous professional learning. They are not too they're willing to sweat the small stuff or the seemingly small stuff. They're really, really good, and it's really strong to have this internal team which is growing all the time. These are all of the sources that I read in order to put this INSET together and develop the materials. And then teachers then went off into mixed group discussions, loosely sort of faculty based, but vertical across the college. So prep teachers with upper school teachers to discuss this, because it's not just up to me. It needs to actually then be integrated into daily life in the school. So they split into mixed groups to talk about how they would make their adjustments for the 3 patterns of understanding, to pair up with a peer and to arrange peer pop-ins over the coming weeks to focus on that response and to give each other feedback, because this is how we're really going to be successful. Thank you very much.